Deployment is the most critical part of the entire game, and if you don't master these things I'm about to talk about, you will always be struggling to continue your successes in competitive 40k. So let's break it all down. I'm going to teach all the nuances of deployment so that we can, I don't know, crush people and not get crushed. So what's the point of deployments? What's the point of the video? What's the point of all of that type of stuff? Well, first step is you need to stage. I'll give a great definition of what staging your models mean. I'm going to break that down for you. You need to set up for if you're going first or second. So when you deploy, you need to know, are you going first or are you going second? And what are you going to do if you go first, and what are you going to do if you go second? Too many people think it depends on the cards that you draw. It basically should never depend on the card that you draw. That should be a secondary thing that you do. You pretty much should always know where you're moving turn if you go first or you go second. It's going to dictate all of your future movement phases, which is pretty much wrapped up in the last thing I just said. Don't forget your reserves. That's part of your deployment. So what's in strategic reserve? What is in deep strike? That is a big part of your deployment. Guys, I'm going to teach you the sacred laws of deployment, and you're all going to improve your gameplay dramatically from just this video alone. So let's break it down. I'm going to be using TTS to actually show you guys some of the screens. I took some screenshots, but I'm also going to go on to the actual video to kind of break it all down for you as well. So let's go through law number 1. You got to know the freaking mission. You need to know, are you going to be playing Scorched Earth? Are you going to be playing Lynchman? Are you going to be playing Burn of Trust? It doesn't matter, but if you don't know the mission that you're playing, you're going to deploy incorrectly for it. So you have to know, how are you going to score your points? If you are playing, let's say, Supply Drop, you know for a fact that it's going to be a low-scoring primary game, and you desperately need to be trying to make sure that you have enough alive to guarantee that you're going to be able to hold that primary in round 5. Critical. Then you need to know, how are you going to get your secondaries? So I have a little chart here. I've got a little picture that I took of how I would deploy my Blood Angels army, for example. If you look at the deployment, and we'll go more into depth in this, and I'll actually do it more hands-on when I go to the TTS screen as well. But if you look at the deployment, what I did is I drew lines, and those lines are where your opponent can actually see you. So basically, everything is perfectly safe except for the little Mephiston. I don't know if you can see my mouse right here, but the Mephiston's on the left side of the screen. He's just kind of standing up there all alone. He's exposed, but he's blown up, so I don't really care that he's exposed. So the army is actually deployed that if I get draw containment, turn 1, Mephiston will get me containment on one side, the Kaldis will get me containment on the second side. The army is deployed so that if I get a cleanse, my Ball Predator on the right can drive up and get me cleanse on the right objective. I've got scouts somewhere in the middle. It's a little bit clipped off in this picture, but they can get me cleanse in the middle. They can get me area denial in the middle. They can get me engage. They can get me established locus in the middle. So basically everything that I can score turn 1, I can score turn 1 because I'm deployed for it. Things that you need to know about your mission. Do you score for holding your home field objective? Because if you do score for holding your home field objective, you're going to have something to hold the home field objective, and you're also going to have something to screen your backfield so your opponent can't deep strike and steal your home field objective. Think about a match like Lynchpin. You're going to have to make sure that you hold your home field no matter what. Versus if you're playing Scorched, maybe not Scorched Earth, that's not a good example. Supply Drop, though, it doesn't matter if you have your home field. Do you only get points for holding 2 objectives, or do you get points for holding 3 objectives? Or is it a game like Purge the Foe where you're getting points for killing your enemy? These are all questions that you have to understand, and if you don't deploy specifically for those individual missions, then you're going to struggle. Law number 2, you need to understand your army's rules. This is a very big deal. What units in your army are dedicated to doing actions? So let me give you an example. My Space Marine Scouts and my Blood Angels army. These guys, turn 1, they're scoring me cleanse, establish locus, area denial. They can sometimes get me behind enemy lines with a cheeky little turn 1 charge. They can get me an assassinate if you have a lone op character that's kind of deployed with infiltrate. Say it's a Kaldis, or if it's a Vindicare assassin or something like that. They can get me a ton of different secondaries turn 1 based off of where they are. They can also move block the crap out of my opponent turn 1, because I can just advance them up, have them stand in front of like 2 or 3 vehicles, and just say, cool, your vehicles don't get to move in turn 1. Of course, you get to kill my scouts for free, but you also basically don't get a turn 1 movement phase. So that's what they're for. You need to know what units are dedicated to killing your army. So in my Blood Angels army, for example, my Sanguinary Guard are dedicated to going and murdering someone's face off, whereas my Gladiator Lancers are dedicated to controlling the movement lanes. I actually don't even necessarily need my Lancers to pop off and kill things, because my Lancer's job is to make sure that my opponent can't move their scary things in the movement lanes. So you need to really understand your unit. Is your unit's job to be a threat? Is your unit's job to actually do the damage? Lots of questions about that. What units do you have dedicated to holding objectives? Well, I know in my army that my Sanguinary Guard are not generally going to activate until turn 4, so they're going to be holding objectives. I know my Ball Predators, I use my Ball Predators as melee bullies, so they're going to move up, they're going to hold objectives, they're going to be overwatching things. I'm going to use my Fight First Loan Up characters to hold objectives because it makes it very challenging for my opponents to interact with them. So these are units I'm using to hold objectives. What units are using controlling movement? Well, I kind of answered that with the scouts. My ball predators are there for Overwatch, things like that, right? Dante's squad has such a massive threat range that if my opponent wants to move anywhere on the board, I can still touch them. That's controlling movement. Another way that you could control movement, let's say that you had a Forge Fiend with rerolls. Say you're playing Chaos Space Marines and you had a Forge Fiend sitting next to Abaddon. Well, that Forge Fiend, who can Dark Pact for sustained hits, and maybe he's next to a Hailbrote, so he also gets lethal hits, and he gets to full reroll hit rolls. Suddenly, this guy by himself could just stop an army from moving in one firing lane on the battlefield, because if he's sitting there, then he could just more or less delete anything within Overwatch. So understand your army's rules. Law number 3, you need to analyze your opponent's list. What army are you playing against? If you're playing against World Eaters, you will deploy very differently than if you're playing against an Iron Serum Space Marines, for example. So questions you need to ask yourself. Does your opponent have fire support to control movement lanes? Do they have those lancers? Do they have that forging? Because if they don't, that means you're going to be able to relatively easily move through the movement lanes without having to worry about your units just getting completely deleted. And that is a very powerful thing to know, because that's going to change the way that you deploy. You can deploy more aggressively, maybe more in the open against orcs, for example, if they're playing Warhorde, because you know they're not shooting you. If you're playing against orcs in Tactical Brigade, where you know they could shoot, you can't really deploy out in the open, or you're going to get tabled turn 1. So is your opponent's, do they have the melee pressure to dig you out of deep cover? So for example, if you have some really tough firing support that's sitting in cover, can your opponent charge through walls to get into you and ruin your day? Do they have the Corn Berserkers? Do they have the Orc Knobs? Do they have the whatever to be able to get those entrenched guns destroyed? If they do, then you're going to have to make sure that you deploy with screening units set up in front. And don't worry, I'm going to go through all this on the TTS screen once I'm done talking about it. So I'm going to show you how to do this as well. Then you need to have those screening units in front to make sure that those heavy-duty melee units can't get to your fragile shooting things without being contested. Does your opponent are they a hyper elite army? Do they trade poorly? Are you playing against Custodes, where Custodes cannot dedicate a 400-point brick of infantry to go kill your 40-point units of Gretchen? Are you playing against orcs, who can send a 40-point unit of Gretchen to stand in front of the Custodes army and say, hey, you can't move because I don't care if you kill my units because I've got way more than you? These are things that you have to understand when you're doing your deployment. This is also going to influence your secondary decisions, right? So if your opponent is playing Green Tide with like 120 orc boys, you're probably going to take Cold Horde as a fixed objective. You probably don't need to bother with taking tactical objectives. But most of the time, you'll find that tactical objectives are basically always going to be better. And then law number 4, let's plan for turn 2 and beyond. So basically, I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. But one thing that I find a lot of my clients and a lot of other people tend to not do is they do not know what happens if they go second. They deploy and they're like, cool, when I go first, I'm going to move my models here, I'm going to move my models there, I'm going to blah, 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 blah. But then they roll to go second and they're like, crap, let me think for 10 minutes about what I do now. When I deploy, my recommendation for you, well, let me tell you what I do, and then I'll give you my recommendation. What I do is I put all of my models in such a position that I know I am not going to be shot, and I'm going to show you in just a moment how to draw those lines to make sure you're not going to be shot. So I know that I'm not going to get shot turn 1. I also know that I'm not going to get charged turn 1 because I'm going to account for that. I also know that turn 1, I'm going to move up to what we call my natural expansion. I'm going to show you that in a minute. That's basically just the safe objective that you can hold. And I know I'm going to be able to stage my models in such a place where it makes it so really challenging for my opponent to deal with it. Staging, I'm also going to give you a great definition of that in just a slide from now. Typically, when I play round 1, my movement phase takes me 5 minutes because I already know what I'm doing in turn 1 if I go first or second when I'm done with deployment. So just make sure that you have a plan when you're doing deployment, and that's going to make your deployment much better. So let's talk about this whole staging concept. I've said the word quite a few times. Let me explain what I mean by staging. All right, so in this picture here, this is a very wordy wall of text. I'm going to read it to you just because this was actually written by my mod Ian in the Discord. And I think he just explained it really, really well. So I'm just going to read it verbatim to you. Just take a look at this picture, and because that's what we're going to be talking about. I have a truck here. And maybe I can actually make this just a little bit bigger on screen for just a moment so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So I have a truck here. and he's heading out inside this middle of this wall. And if you see this little purple line that's coming right outside the building, and you can see the purple line towards the bottom of the screen as well, that purple line is going to be a 15-inch line from the truck, right? Now keep that in mind as I read this paragraph to you, because this is going to make a lot of sense, and it's going to be really important for you to understand what we mean when we're talking about staging, right? The trick to staging, this is quote, the trick to staging that I found is imagine the threat you project and use that. For example, this truck is butt to wall, and it means you get to get out 3 inches from the truck when you disembark, and then you move 6 inches. So basically, you get a free 9-inch move with the basic 6-inch infantry when you disembark from a truck. And then you still get to charge. Now, let's assume that you are comfortable with risking a 6-inch charge. That's your safe number for it's meaning that it's a consistent enough charge. You don't want to risk your entire army on rolling 9-inch charges, because you know you only have a 27% or 27% chance of landing that charge. It might actually be 21. I don't remember. Doesn't matter. But you know, if it's a 6-inch charge, you're willing to roll the dice on that. So that means you're giving your opponent 15 inches of the board that they cannot move there, because then you get to touch them. And if your opponent is cautious, just having your model there and not moving out is even better than actually charging them, because that means that turn over turn, they still can't move into those areas without being reached out and touched by your devastating melee units. It's a really, really big deal. Now, Ian goes on to explain, you can then stack this up with multiple units. You can stack it up with shooting support, where you can threaten to kill things for free / poor return, picking up scoring units and chaff with your chaff and low commitment models. So basically, you can have a truck deployed like it is deployed there. You can have another truck deployed in the other room. You can have another truck deployed, say, on the right side of the screen behind that terrain there that is not exposed, but you can always just get out and charge from. So that is what we mean by staging, projecting threat without actually exposing yourself. If you're playing Blood Angels, where that truck is standing, that's a great place for Dante to be standing, for example, because he can move out there 19 inches in any direction and be beautifully staged. So that is basically the best explanation of staging that more or less anyone can give you. Okay, now let's talk about drawing firing lanes. So if you look at this picture here, and once again, I'm going to do all this on the TTS screen in just a few moments for you. There are a bunch of colored lines, these blue lines here. These are what we call firing lanes. So when you are on these firing lanes, that means that you can see all the way down that line. So if you look at this predator or this vindicator that's circled by the big green circle, there's a blue line that is crossing right behind him. That means he can see down that line and shoot those, I don't know, they look like inquisitorial agents or something, that they can shoot them, okay? That means that they're on the firing lane. If you look on the left, you see all these predators. These predators can see Canis Rex, and they can all shoot Canis Rex because they're touching that blue line. The one predator who's in the back, will not be able to draw the line from that line. There'll be another line that we would have to draw. That's not deployed there. So what I recommend you do is you get on TTS or in real life, set up all the terrain and draw your lines. In real life, you'll use like a little laser pointer, and TTS, you'll just actually draw the line to show you where you will need to stand to shoot and where you need to stand so that you can't get shot turn 1. And once again, I'm going to show you this in just a moment. Another thing that I really want you to look at is where can you safely deploy behind the walls, and where can you safely deploy behind walls or behind terrain that doesn't impede your vehicle's movement. So let's look at this Vindicator over here that is circled by the big green circle. He is touching that big blue line, as you can see, and that means that, let's say the Imperial Knights player had big knights over there, that means that they would be able to shoot the Vindicator. But if the Vindicator just scooted slightly over to the right, he would no longer be touching that blue line, which means that they could not shoot him. But because of the ruin in front of him, there's no wall directly in front of him. He can just still move if he goes first, unimpeded, without having to worry about having to be able to not being able to move through walls, because he's being blocked by the templates of the terrain, not the actual physical wall itself. And that's a really big deal. That'll dictate your deployment. That'll dictate where you can safely put things on the table. Now, there's a few special circumstances when we're talking about terrain and deployment. You've got 2 keywords in this game that are kind of problematic. So the towering keyword, it means your model only has to be within terrain and not wholly within terrain to be able to see through it. So if I go back to the other line, see where Canis Rex is touching that, kind of touching that terrain? That means he can see directly through that terrain as if it wasn't really there. I mean, more or less, right? That's a really, really powerful ability, because you can kind of see, and let me just kind of enlarge this picture for everybody. You can kind of see that you have some Chaos Spawn on the left side that were hiding behind that terrain, but now that Canis Rex is touching it, he can see them. Normal vehicles can't do that. Only vehicles with the towering keyword can. Okay, so that's something you have to be aware of when you're trying to hide your models. Does the enemy have towering or not? Because if they have towering, you might not be hidden as you think you are. Then the other special circumstance is the aircraft keyword. Aircraft use true line of sight, meaning ruins have no effect on these units. If they can actually draw a line of sight to you, they can see you. It doesn't matter if there's a ruin in the way. And that's something that most people just don't realize, basically because aircraft is more or less just not played in 10th edition. So it's a big issue if your opponent is using aircraft, if they find an aircraft that is actually good, like the Tiger Shark Bertao, which is a bonkers model. So just be aware of that. All right, now I'm going to give you a few quick tips, and then I'm going to wrap all of this together in one big presentation on the TTS screen that I'm going to move models around and show you exactly what we're talking about. So quick tips here. What I want you guys to do when you're talking about deploying is you're going to deploy safely. If you can't deploy safely, then you can deploy exposed, which you don't generally want to deploy exposed. Deploying safely is if your opponent has a bunch of shooting, you want to make sure you don't get shot. You can deploy exposed if they don't have a lot of shooting or if they don't have crazy turn one movement like World Eaters, for example. Then you can deploy exposed where your opponents, you don't care if they see you because you're not going to get shot anyway. And then lastly, the other option for deploying, which could be totally good, is deploy where your opponent can shoot you, but it's going to put them in a very bad position to do so. So on this little picture that you can see here, I drew a little circle with a little arrow that's pointing in the middle of the circle. If you're touching that line, you can see this ball predator right here. But that's going to force your opponent to move into a bad position to actually be able to draw that line of sight into your predator. Because the second they put themselves there, they're going to be exposed to all sorts of other shenanigans that can then draw line of sight to them. So sometimes I will actually deploy something with the intention of allowing my opponent to see them turn one, but they have to move in a really bad place if they want to draw that line of sight. And I can be very comfortable with that occasionally. All right, so now I'm going to switch to the TTS view. I'm going to put this all together for you. So if you've been scratching your head, I'm going to make it all make sense right now, but you had to hear all of that first. So here we go. TTS view right now. All right, so this is my Blood Angels army, the Bloody Road. I love this army. It is unbelievably powerful. If you haven't done it, then you should check out my video where I detail it out. It crushes souls. So right here, I've drawn all these thick red lines. These are our line of sight angles. So right here, there's a big line of sight from this ruin to here, meaning anything that's behind this red line can't be seen, meaning that they cannot draw a line of sight to anything here. They won't draw a line of sight to the scouts because the scouts will just scout backwards if I go second, right? Mephiston is going to be the only thing that can be seen from your opponent's deployment zone, more or less deployment zone, because they could draw this line from right here into Mephiston, right? That's where that big, thick red line is. But Mephiston is blown up, so they were still going to have to be within 12 inches if they want to see him, meaning basically nothing in the game is going to be able to shoot him turn one. And if they do, once again, I'm comfortable with it because then they're going to be in a bad position, and I'll get to shoot them. Then I'm going to have this big, thick lining. There's nothing I can do to avoid allowing my opponent to shoot my ball predator if they kind of move slightly up the table here. But I accept that because the second they do that, they're going to be exposed to both of my Lancers in my turn. So I'm okay with my opponent killing my ball predator turn one if it means the thing that he exposed also immediately dies to both of my Lancers, right? And you can see these big, thick lines. The models that want to shoot on that line would have to be touching them. Over here, where this ball predator is deployed, nothing can see him turn one because they can't draw a line from right there, as you see. If they want to be standing wholly within the terrain, they certainly can't draw a line of sight through here because the ruins block line of sight. So everything is perfectly safe except for the ball predator from this one angle and Mephiston if my opponent wants to get hyper aggressively close to them. Once again, the scouts will be safe because if I go second, I'll just scout them backwards into this terrain. Now, let me kind of talk you through this deployment, okay? If I were to go first, it's very, very simple. I am deployed in such a way that I can score basically every single secondary in the game right now. So if I draw containment, you guys can see, I'll just put on the containment walls here. 9 inches away from the deployment, the side of the table, outside the deployment zone. Chief Librarian Mephiston goes and gets me containment turn one. The Calidus Assassin is already getting me a containment right here where she is because she's outside the deployment zone. She's within 9 of the board edge. So containment is now officially done. Let's say I draw containment and area denial. All right, Mephiston gets me containment. Calidus gets me containment. Scouts get me area denial. Not bad. Let's say I get established locust and containment. Scouts are getting me established locust. These two are getting me containment. Let's say I get cleanse. Well, scouts are cleansing. He's doing whatever he needs to do. Calidus can come out and get me a cleanse. I can also move up a ball predator to get me a cleanse. Not a problem, and he's still basically safe from most shooting lines. There will be a shooting line here now to be able to get into him, but that I'm probably okay with that. If I'm not okay with that, then I just put him right back where he is, and I bring the jump pack assault intercessors up to do it, right? So I've got units positioned everywhere on the board in order to score basically any possible secondary that I can draw turn 1. Of course, you can get screwed if you draw Overwhelming Force or if you draw like Assassinate, but there's nothing you can do about those. So when you're deploying, make sure that you can deploy everything you can score turn 1. Now, if I go first, I know for a fact that Dante is going right here because this is the best place in the entire map to be staged, like I was kind of explaining earlier. Because from right here, Dante is going to have he can move up to 19 inches depending on how far he advances, and then he can charge at +1. So he basically can touch anything on the entire map from this one step point. So if I go first, Dante is always going to move directly right here. So let's roll in advance. He won't be able to be shot here from basically any angle. And I am ready to go reach out and touch my opponent and just ruin their freaking days. If I go first, a lot of times my scouts will just advance forward and they'll stand in front of the line if my opponent has a bunch of vehicles, and he'll say, cool, you don't get to move turn 1. If I happen to draw like the area denial, they would just come stand here and give me the area denial. If I happen to draw none of those and there's nothing to move block, then what I might end up doing, just pull Dante back ever so slightly, and I might just put the scouts right here. So if my opponent wants to charge through the walls into Dante, they're going to have to charge into the scouts. And then Dante can do a heroic intervention, right? So this is basically just the most beautiful spot on GW1 that you could ever deploy on. I'm in position so that if I go second, though, nothing can get shot except for my ball predator. And if my opponent wants to expose himself to the ball predator, I just immediately blow him up. So I know exactly what's going to happen if I go first. This ball predator is probably going to advance, and he's going to come stand right here. These guys are going to stand like roughly right here. Probably not going to move the lancers at all. I might advance this lancer to stand right here. That's a possibility. This ball predator might move up to be like this. That's a possibility. These JPI probably just stand right here. No problem. And I'll score basically whatever secondaries. The Ballista's Dread might move up to be over here. I know I can't walk through a wall, so let me do that a little more cleanly for you. 3.7. He might come up here just so now he's controlling this firing line, and he's still going to have cover against basically anything that wants to shoot him. So it allows me to take a very aggressive board position based off of whether I go first or if I go second. I don't care because I can't be shot anyway. So that's what we're talking about when we want an aggressive deployment. So with that, guys, I think I'm going to close it out. This is my recommendations for how you deploy. Make sure you can score any secondary you can possibly draw, and make sure that you know what's going to happen when you go first. You know what's going to happen when you go second, regardless of what enemy you are facing. With that, I'm going to close out this deployment tutorial, and I hope you guys have an amazing freaking day. Crump on. Bye-bye.